What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Today we're going to talk about exercise technique for alternative modes and non-traditional implement resistance training. Let's get it popping. So just like with traditional resistance training, non-traditional resistance training there follows similar guidelines that we do with traditional resistance training. Number one, make sure that your body's properly lined up there, making sure the body's in a good, stable position. If you're standing on the ground there, typically your feet should be wider than shoulder width and your feet should remain flat on the ground. Make sure you choose an appropriate grip, maybe supinated, pronated, alternating grip, neutral grip, depending on the particular exercise being performed. In general, we should be breathing in during the eccentric phase and blowing out the air during the concentric phase. And then finally, with very heavy loads, greater than 80% of your 1 rep max, or if you take lighter weights there but you perform them to failure, the Valsalva maneuver should be performed on the last couple of reps there, meaning breathing in and holding your breath. This will create a more rigid torso, preventing unwanted back injuries. One non-traditional means of resistance training is bodyweight training. Several different benefits that go along with bodyweight training. Number one is, unlike machines, which kind of have you locked into a specific range of motion or a specific way of moving, bodyweight training allows each person to move based on their own individual anthropometrics, meaning some people have longer arms versus some people have relatively shorter arms. Some people longer legs, some relatively shorter legs. Some have long torsos while others have short torsos. And with bodyweight training there, you just move with your body weight. So because of that there, it's very individualized for each person because you're moving about your own body weight. Number two, bodyweight resistance training often includes closed chain based exercises. Number three, oftentimes bodyweight training there incorporates several different muscle groups at once. For example, a bodyweight squat will incorporate strengthening your quads and your glute muscles. Number four there helps you develop relative strength, meaning how strong you are compared to the amount of body weight that you have. For example, gymnasts are typically strong relative to their body weight. So they're relatively lighter in nature, but they're very strong compared to that actual body weight. It's one reason why gymnasts can perform a lot of pull-ups. Now, someone who does not have a lot of relative strength might be somebody like a sumo wrestler. So a sumo wrestler is strong, but because their body weight is so large, therefore they might not be as relatively strong compared to that gymnast. Bodyweight training can help improve body control. And lastly, is a low-cost training alternative to traditional resistance training. Because bodyweight only requires your body weight, doesn't require you to purchase any bands or weights or any other extra pieces of equipment there. Bodyweight training can be a low-cost alternative to traditional resistance training. Next up, core stability and balance training methods. Core stability in this PowerPoint slide set is going to focus mainly on the muscles that attach along that axial skeleton here. Okay, so those muscles that attach here towards your torso there. What this will do is the stronger you can make yourself in core training there, it is suggested that you'll be able to produce more force using your arms and in your legs there. Isolation exercises are typically used when performing core training. And the main purpose of these exercises, for example, this side plank there, is to isolate specific core musculature without having to use the lower or upper or your arms and legs that much there when performing the exercise. So for example, in this side plank here, they're targeting the obliques, okay, and the muscles along the side of your torso while minimizing the amount of arm and leg muscle use during this particular exercise. Now, as we talked about before, while isolated core training can be valuable there, Ground-based free weight activities, such as this barbell back squat, they can offer similar, or in some cases, greater activation of your core muscles when compared to just traditional isolation core training, as shown here on the previous slide. So again, there might be a specific reason for you to do traditional core training, but it might not need it if you lift heavy enough with your more traditional resistance training exercises. Now, comparing free weight exercises, such as performing these dumbbell rows, compared to machine exercises, performing these machine rows, the benefits for machines is that they can offer a greater amount of stability, and therefore, because your body is more stable, you might be able to focus more on your targeting the specific muscles that you are trying to develop. So for example here, in performing this machine rows, these machine rows there often target your latissimus dorsi, your big back muscles, as well as your rhomboids, the muscles between your shoulder blades. So because you're in a more stable position using the machine, it might be easier to focus on contracting those muscles compared to the bent over row here. The bent over row, the reason being is that you have to focus on stabilizing other things, such as your hips, okay? Maybe some of the smaller muscles in your shoulders. You got to activate your core a little bit more because your hand's placed on the bench. So therefore, there's going to be greater stabilizer muscle activation when performing free weight exercises. Since in our sports there, we're oftentimes in an environment where we have to activate our stabilizer muscles more, it is theorized that free weight exercises might offer the ideal combination of specifically focusing on the main muscle groups, as well as having to activate some of your stabilizer muscles when performing the movements. Again, it's just a theory. Whether it's true or not there, more research would need to be done. However, there's some exercises that go beyond the traditional resistance training exercises where there is some instability to the point where it's making things very unstable. For example, performing a push-up on this stability ball, you're going to be shaking as you're performing that push-up. So in this case here, your stabilizer muscles are activated a ton when performing this movement. Typically, instability training, where you purposely try to want to make things really unstable, is oftentimes used in physiotherapy settings. So for example, maybe you're recovering from an injury, and therefore these exercises might be used by your physical therapist to help you get back strong again. Now, benefits of this instability exercises is that they may increase core muscle activation. However, because you're more unstable, that's going to reduce your force output. And specifically, with these instability exercises, force output can be decreased by 30% or more. This is like saying if you can squat 300 pounds, that means if you're performing a squat on a unstable surface, you might only be able to squat 200 pounds. That's roughly a reduction of 30% of the most amount of weight that you could squat. So instability exercises, while they activate the stabilizer muscles more, they decrease force output a ton. And since in our sports, most sports there, we typically are not in a super unstable position, it begs the question whether we truly should incorporate a lot of instability devices in our training. So what are the key points there? Number one, free weight ground-based exercises, such as barbell back squats, dumbbell lunges, barbell bench press, dumbbell bent over rows, may offer the ideal combination of specificity and instability, especially if someone's trying to focus on strength and power development. In addition, ground-based free weight exercises, such as squats, deadlifts, Olympic lifts, they involve a degree of instability that allows for simultaneous development of all lengths of the kinetic chain. essentially meaning that we're activating a ton of muscle groups and having certain muscle groups contract at certain times there in a proper order there, which might help a much better development of your core muscle stability compared to instability device-based exercises. Moving on, let's look at variable resistance training methods. Traditionally, when we think about resistance training, we think about constant external resistance exercises. These are exercises where the amount of resistance being lifted stays the same throughout the entire range of motion. This oftentimes occurs with free weight exercises. So for example, when I'm performing this dumbbell bench press, I'm going to lower the dumbbells and raise them above my head, and the amount of weight being lifted stays the same no matter what. So these, let's say they're 25-pound dumbbells. These dumbbells are going to weigh the same no matter if they're above your head or at your chest level. Traditional resistance training methods, therefore, better mimic real-life activities because in most real-life activities there, the resistance that we're trying to push or pull doesn't change there in our activities. However, there are a couple different ways that we can introduce some changing in the amount of resistance that we are pushing against when we are lifting weights. One way we can do this there is through variable resistance training. And what this type of training does, it alters the resistance so that muscle maximizes force throughout the full range of motion. Okay? And we oftentimes see this with the use of different sized cams in machine weightlifting movements. So you can see this misshapen cam there. Typical cam would be a circle, but notice here how this is different shape there. Kind of looks like a little bean or something along those lines. And what this does is it makes the lift easier during the weaker parts of the movement and more difficult during the tougher parts of the movement. So if I were performing bicep curls here using this cam would purposely make it easier for me to lift the bar when my arm's in a more extended position, and likewise make it easier to fully collapse the elbow when the elbow is almost fully flexed. In the middle there, the cam would make it more difficult during this middle portion where typically we are the strongest. So again, variable resistance training makes the lift easier during the weaker parts of the movement and more difficult during the tougher parts of the movement. And this is oftentimes done through machines using different size cams as that cable stack is moving. Another way we can do this, and this is traditionally done with free weights, is through accommodating resistance. What accommodating resistance does is it changes the resistance, allowing for the speed of the movement to be controlled through the entire range of motion. And what this does is it usually incorporates chains and bands there to make it easier at the bottom of the movement and more difficult at the top of the movement. So let's go into those in a little bit more depth here. Let's first start focusing on chain supplemented exercises. So when we're using chains there, make sure that we understand the structure of the chain, the density of the chain, whether it's plastic or maybe metal, the length of the chain, and the diameter of the chain being used. Depending on the exercise, different size chains might work better than others. When you're performing these chain-based exercises, you need to understand how much the chain adds to the amount of weight on the bar at the top compared to how it changes at the bottom of the movement. Typically, chains should only be used with experienced athletes who have stable exercise technique. Using chains with someone who hasn't had any training experience or maybe 1 year of lifting weight experience is probably not that helpful nor beneficial for that particular athlete because they can gain similar benefits without having to add on the added complexity of using the chains. So that means when using a chain there on free weight exercises, the chain should barely be touching the floor when you're at the top of the lift. The reason we don't want them completely off the ground at the top of the lift is that by a little bit of the chain being on the ground at the top of the lift, it prevents the chains from swaying back and forth. If the chains are swaying back and forth, that would create instability, which is not what we're trying to create. So therefore, that means at the top of the lift, normally where it's easier, with more chain links off the ground at the top of the lift, that makes the exercise a little bit more challenging at the top. Then at the bottom of the exercise, more chain links are on the ground. Therefore, the bar is actually lighter at the bottom, where the exercise typically is the most difficult. Same benefit we see are with bands there. Now you could figure out how much resistance is being applied with bands there using Hooke's law. We're not going to do it in this presentation there, but that is something you could figure out there. Now you got to be careful is just because two bands look the same doesn't mean they're actually provide the same amount of resistance. And that's due to mainly that over time, resistance bands gets more stretched out. When they get more stretched out, they lose how much strength they have, and therefore an old band compared to a new band, that old band is going to provide less resistance compared to the new band, which is going to provide more resistance. So just be careful when choosing bands here for banded exercises. Now, just like with chains there's going to be more weight on the bar, and I put weight in quotation marks, at the top of the lift because the band is more stretched out, versus there's going to be much less weight or resistance at the bottom of the lift because the band is a lot more slack. But in both cases there, chains and bands make it more difficult at the top and easier at the bottom. Moving on to non-traditional implement training methods. These are gaining in popularity there. However, due to them being relatively new to the general population there, more research is being done each and every day to give us more insight into how to effectively use these non-traditional implements in our training methods. One of these ways that non-traditional implement training has become used is due to the rise in popularity of strongman training. Strongman is a sport where these large, strong athletes there perform unique lifts using kind of like stuff you might find around the farm or maybe in everyday life there, and trying to move these heavy objects there. 3 types of these implements that are used are tire flipping, log lifting, and farmer's walk. And we'll talk about each of these 3 different exercises in the next few slides. First, let's look at tire flipping. So notice taking that tire from the ground, lifting it up, and then trying to flip and tip it over. Make sure when choosing a tire for your athletes that it's appropriate for your athlete based on their body dimensions. For example, this huge tire here I probably would not use with a 5-year-old. That wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. When flipping a tire, you could use your sumo position with your feet, so feet wide with toes pointed out. Maybe a back lift, okay, meaning you're facing the other way instead of facing forward, facing the other way and lifting it, as well as shoulders against the tire technique, which is the more common one that's used in order to complete the lift. Here's one common technical flaw with flipping the tire. Number 1 is placing your feet too close to the tire while initiating the movement. What this does is it oftentimes causes the athlete to round their back and puts their knees close to the chest, which doesn't put you in a very mechanically advantageous position. Recommendation there is to move your feet farther away from the tire and telling the athlete there to raise their chest while contracting the musculature of the lower back. So going back to this here, notice the feet are farther away, and as they raise that flip or raise that tire off the ground there, they are raising the chest while contracting the musculature of the lower back. Another common flaw is the hips rise faster than the shoulders during the initial push. So instead of this one here, where the shoulders are above the hips, weaker athletes or people who don't know proper technique, the hips will actually be above the shoulders. To help correct this there, tell the athletes to keep their hips low and drive the tire forward rather than lifting it. In addition, as mentioned previously, try to keep the hips slightly below the shoulders while flipping the tire. Another flaw is that a lifting motion is used instead of a pushing motion. So instead of pushing into the tire, the athlete tries to just lift it straight up. Okay. This causes the athlete to lose momentum, causing the athlete to muscle the tire over, which puts a lot of stress on the athlete and puts them in a less advantageous position and puts them in a more dangerous position there. So again, correction with this, tell them to drive the tire forward, not up there as you're lifting it up. So here's kind of all 5 phases there. Driving into the tire, lifting it up, using a knee there to support it, flip it over, and repeat. Log lifting, if you'll notice here, as this person's pressing this log above their head, it's similar to pressing a barbell above your head, especially since you can add weights on each side of the log there. However, due to the log being wider, you're not able to keep it as close to your body as you can with a traditional bar. So that means that it can make it a lot more challenging than pressing a traditional bar above your head. Now, very little research has been looked into log pressing, so more research needs to be done to see what are the effective loads when performing log presses. Farmer's walk comes from picking up and holding heavy weights, one on each side, and walking around a weight room or some sort of area there in order to strengthen your body. This farmer's walk there are very good for enhancing core strength, as well as grip strength, back endurance, and total body anaerobic endurance. So farmer's walks, carrying heavy things on each side of your body there, very effective way for performing some non-traditional implement training. Kettlebell training, while traditionally not used a whole lot there in strongman competitions, they can be very useful, especially if you perform a ton of reps over a relatively longer period of time, which can improve some cardiovascular health there. However, the cardiovascular health benefit probably is not going to be as beneficial as traditional aerobic exercise. Likewise, we can use kettlebells to improve strength gains, but typically the strength gains for using kettlebells are going to be much lower than those seen with traditional resistance training. Instead of pressing with both arms or both legs at the same time, otherwise known as bilateral training, oftentimes performing unilateral training or using one arm or one leg at a time can be effective there, specifically trying to reduce bilateral asymmetries, meaning that if my right arm is stronger than my left arm, performing unilateral training might help even out my right and my left sides there. And that's because through bilateral training, the tendency is to shift more of the weight towards the arm or the leg that is stronger. A lot of times unilateral training is used in rehab as well. Now, there are 2 terms that come with unilateral and bilateral. One is the bilateral deficit. That means that if, for example, you're doing a bench press, and let's say you're performing a dumbbell bench press versus a barbell bench press. With the dumbbell bench press, we're lifting one arm at a time, and some research has shown that if you take the total amount of weight that you can lift with your right arm and the total amount of weight you can lift with your left arm with the dumbbell, adding those weights together sometimes has been shown to be add up to more than the total amount of weight that you could press with both arms at the same time. So that's what bilateral deficit means, is that if you add up each arm individually, the total amount of weight each arm individually could lift, that might be more than lifting with both arms or both legs at the same time. The opposite of that is bilateral facilitation, meaning that if we add up the total amount of weight lifted with the right arm, the total amount of weight lifted with the left arm. Those together will be less than the total amount of weight that we can use with both arms or both legs at the same time. So in conclusion, a lot of different ways we can overload the muscles. We can do that through traditional resistance training or some of the non-traditional methods that were discussed in this PowerPoint slide set. The level of your athletes that you're working with dictate which methods in this presentation, if any, should be used. Typically for novice and untrained athletes, it is relatively safer to perform body weight or core isolation stability exercises. With stronger and more elite athletes there, traditional ground-based free weight exercises should be used, as well as different variable resistance exercises, such as adding bands and chains there to our exercises. As always, make sure to teach proper form and safely monitor training. That's all I got. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a good day. Booyah.